Great, well I think we'll make a start to this. I'm Isabel, Hardman, the Assistant Editor of the Spectator. I'm going to be chairing this policy exchange event on how do we build 300,000 homes a year. I'm joined by a fantastic panel who are going to unpick that for us, hopefully. I have Roberta Blackman-Woods, who is the Shadow Communities and Local Government Minister for Labour. I have Greenwood, the Managing Director of Readymix Concrete, Lafarge Tarmac, and thank you so much to them for making this event possible as well. We've got Shaun, Spiers, the Chief Executive of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and Policy Exchange's Head of Housing, Planning and Urban Policy, Chris Walker. So thank you to all our speakers. Each of them are going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and I'll start telling them off if they waffle on for too long, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. So I think we're going to start with Roberta.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation to be here this evening. I'm sort of tempted to say, in response to the title of this session, oh come on, give us a chance. We've only just issued a pledge to deliver 200,000 houses per year by the end of the next Parliament, and hey, somebody's raised the bar already to 300,000. So what I'm going to concentrate on is telling you how I think we can get to 200,000. And then you can all shout at me and say, well, what about the other 100,000 that you've conveniently forgotten about? I'm really pleased that Ed Miliband has made this commitment to get from where we are at the moment, which is about somewhere around 130,000 housing units delivered in a year, to 200,000, and that might not seem like a huge uplift, but actually it is. Even at the high end of the housing boom, we were only delivering about 160,000 houses. We have to go back some decades before we get anything like 300,000 houses being built in a year. And this is a very, very serious commitment from Labour. And what we did was we asked Sir Michael Lyons to chair a commission for us, which would set out a roadmap, how we get to the level of output that we have at the moment in terms of housing supply to what we need, or nearer to what we need, and we have set at least 200,000 houses by the end of the next Parliament, set out a roadmap for us so that if we get into government in 2015, it's very clear the steps that we have to take. And we asked him to look at a number of areas. First of all, from talking to a lot of developers and local authorities, they came up, I mean, what they told us was that there was a real problem with land supply, and if we're really serious about a major uplift, we need to do something about getting more land into the system. So we put that on Michael's agenda. We also put the funding of infrastructure, because again, a lot of developers told us that what's holding up a lot of development is that they can't get the infrastructure in, and they can't get it in early enough to make a scheme viable. We also wanted to look at the problem of some local authorities not recognising housing need and not working with their immediate neighbour local authorities to be able to meet that need, and we have called that a right to grow, and it's really recognising that the duty to cooperate isn't working. And sort of attached to that, we also asked him to look at some of the mechanisms that might be needed in order to get this major uplift, and specifically we asked him to look at how do we deliver the new generation of new towns, urban extensions, garden cities, garden villages. And lastly, we asked about investment. What can we do to get more investment in the system and to get a wider range of players? And this is very important because we used to deliver a lot more of our housing through small and medium-sized builders. And that's really reduced substantially in recent years. So it is about sort of opening up the market, and it's not just small and medium-sized companies, it's self-build, it's council, bringing some council housing back into the mix, housing associations, community build, all of that, because we need everything. You know, there isn't just one answer to this, and it's also building for private rent as well. It's not just house sale. So he hasn't reported yet. The report's going to be out very soon, but he has got important things to say on all of those areas that we hope will help really shift this agenda forward. And it is some of the detail that is going to be in the report. We have set the policy, we've given the commitment to this major uplift in housing supply. We just wanted him to help us work out some of the solutions and some of the things that we need to do and some of the partnerships that we need to develop in order to deliver it. And I should say, we also asked him to do something which is really quite difficult, and that's put consent at the heart of development and to ensure that communities are really involved in decisions that are made about where new housing goes, what it looks like, what sort of needs it's going to meet, because we're really worried that unless we put consent at the heart of the system, and what you get further down the line is just communities being faced with large planning applications, they might just want to reject them. We need a conversation to happen much, much earlier in the planning system so that people really do have a say over what housing they get. And critically, and this is my last point, really critically, that it helps improve the quality of housing and it ensures that we build housing and communities, because in the past we've often got fixated with the numbers and we've forgotten that we should be placemaking and not just thinking about housing numbers, because if we really want to get consent and we really want to build sustainable communities, then we've got to ensure that there's better quality and all the things that support communities, you know, transport, employment, energy, you know, schools, services are put in the mix as well. Thank you.
Thank you. You were perfectly on time, so that's very good indeed. So we'll move on now to Jeremy, who's going to speak to us.
Okay, well, good afternoon. First, let me tell you a little bit about Lafarge Tarmac. Lafarge Tarmac are the UK's largest supplier of construction materials, with operations across the length and breadth of the country. So clearly we do have a vested interest in this debate, and we're a strong part of the debate. But the reason we've chosen to sponsor this debate tonight is actually to do more with the fact that we see as an employer that the availability and quality of affordable housing impacts directly on people's education and on their health. And certainly for us it impacts on people's ability to move around the country for employment and to find work. And that's the reason why we're sponsoring this debate. Now we can debate the number, be it 200 or 300, I don't want to have any debates to my right, but it's clearly a significant uplift is required in the number of houses built. And the challenge in doing that is great and complex. From a business point of view, what we'd like to see is some of the root causes addressed on a long-term basis so we can have a sustained environment for investment. And that's what's required to address this shortfall, be it 200 or 300,000. So in terms of the root causes, there's a number of them, certainly one of which, and probably the largest of which, is the planning system. We need to see some improvement in the planning system to give surety of supply and a long-term surety to make sure we can invest in the future. But to be fair, as a construction company, there are root causes we should look at for ourselves as well. The supply of raw materials, the availability and the skills of the workforce available to us, and construction techniques themselves all need to be addressed. It is complex and there is no silver bullet to addressing this. Again, as I say, what we'd like to see as an industry in order to address the backlog is a sustained solution, cross-party consensus, so we know we have the long-term surety, alignment between local and national to make sure we can get that commitment, and to have long-term stable investment signals. Now I won't try and address any of the political issues, but from business I think we need to think about skills, construction materials, government and industry collaboration and innovation. And if I give an example of this, to find the people, skills and materials today to double or triple the number of houses built is very difficult. But actually surety of those is getting worse. And so the situation will be getting worse and not better. So we do need to act, and we do need to act pretty quickly if we're going to be able to address this shortfall. I think one thing I would say is when we're looking at how many, we should also think about how we build them. And again, I'd echo the thought about the sustainable communities as well. When we're dashing to build the houses to fill this shortage gap, let's remember these are being built for generations to come, and let's not sacrifice the quality of the housing for the number. And that's in terms of their environmental impact, not only in construction, but in use. And in thinking about use, we've got to think about how houses are cooled and heated, the environmental impacts of the raw materials that are used to build it, but also construction methods as well. And we do need to be radical. If we just do more of the same faster, we will not get the solution we require. We need to think about innovation in terms of how we build them. We need to use the raw materials smarter, we need to build quicker using less labour, and improve the performance in use and durability of the housing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to move on to Shaun.
Do I get his extra time? I'm going to stand up so I can be the headless man in the policy exchange video. Can we build 300,000 houses a year? Yes, of course we can. We did that when we were a much poorer country after the war. We didn't build 300,000 good quality houses, and Bevan after the war had a commitment to quality, and Labour lost the election partly because it didn't build enough houses. Macmillan then had the commitment to numbers, and a lot of poor quality houses were built. So we need to marry quality and a commitment to numbers. Do we need 300,000 houses? And there I'd be a bit more reluctant. CPRE accepts that we need to build many more houses, that we have far too many people in a very rich country living in substandard housing conditions. So we need to increase house building. But there are problems, as has been suggested, with focusing on numbers alone. It is far easier to set targets than build houses, which is what the last Labour government discovered. And it's far easier to build houses than to build good quality houses and to build communities and have a commitment to placemaking. So I'd be reluctant to just rush to sort of to commit to high targets. We also have to question where the houses go and who they're for. Danny Dorling's book, All That Is Solid, points out that it matters who the houses belong to. And if you just are building houses for speculation or for the private rental market or for people's second homes or whatever, then that's not going to do much for the housing crisis either. So we need to, as I say, be relatively careful about targets, and having built too few houses for many years, let's concentrate on just building a few more and getting the numbers right. What is happening now is that many local communities are faced with unfeasibly high targets that are coming out of the strategic housing market assessments, which are produced by developers, and assume levels of house building that have never been achieved, even in boom years. 100,000 houses over the next 17 or 20 years in Oxfordshire, for instance, which will require a lot of building in the Vale Whitehorse area of outstanding natural beauty, a lot of building in the Oxford Greenbelt and so on, if those numbers are to be achieved. So they're faced with very high housing targets, and they're faced with a particularly high targets for the first 5 years, having to find 5 years worth of land for 5 years worth of housing, often plus 20% to make up the shortfall from the recession era. And what that is requiring them to do is to release a lot of greenfield land, because the housing land they have to provide has to be deemed viable and deliverable. And the test of viability and deliverability is often set by the house builders, who say, no, that brownfield site which you want to develop isn't viable, and by the way, we can't deliver the affordable housing numbers either. So local authorities are really struggling with the way the NPPF is working out, and the house builders are cherry-picking the greenfield sites. And the result of this won't be more houses built. We'll carry on getting too few houses built and too much countryside lost. And the house builders will build the houses they would have built anyway, but instead of building them in towns, they'll be building them in the countryside. And we're seeing that across the country. And I don't really believe that planning is the problem. There is plenty of land, there's plenty of brownfield land in particular. What there is are severe problems in the house building industry in the UK, and you've alluded to a couple of them. But if you look at the annual reports of the major house builders, you don't see anything there about increasing supply. All you see is commitments to increasing margins on their houses, to increasing the value and size of their land bank, and so on. The the major house builders have absolutely no incentive whatsoever massively to increase supply. They got their fingers burnt last time they did it, and they've got a low output, high margin economic model, and they're doing very well. And my top tip for all of you tonight is if you have any spare cash, invest it in the house builders at the moment, because they are getting very good returns. As Roberta has alluded to, the small house builders are struggling. The sector that built 2/3 of our houses 20 or 30 years ago is building 1/3 now, and that's declining. And there are things that need to be done to revive the small building sector. But this government, I think, has been extremely naive in assuming that if you release more land, the big house builders will build more houses. There is no evidence that they will do so, or indeed that that is the solution in itself, because we had plenty of land, very weak planning, and a big housing boom in Ireland and Spain, and it all ended in tears. You need a much more strategic and planned approach. The fact of the matter is that when this country built houses on the scale we're talking about now, for 35 years after the war, the state built more than half of them. And then the state stopped building houses, and the assumption was that the private sector would start building instead, and it hasn't. The private sector has built pretty consistently through the war, since the war, allowing for the peaks and troughs of the economic cycle and the availability of credit and so on. But private sector house delivery has been pretty consistent since the war, regardless of the changes of the planning system, regardless of the amount of land available. And there is no reason, I think, for thinking that simply increasing land availability is going to see a big increase in house building. If you want to achieve 300,000 houses a year, we've got to stop. We've got to start building houses again. The state's going to have to start building houses. The money the state used to spend building houses, it now spends on housing benefit, much of which goes into the pockets of buy-to-let landlords and is a direct sort of redistribution from poorer people towards wealthier people. And that, I think, and CPRE is wholly non-political, and I don't have a party political bone in my body as I speak for CPRE, but that is a big problem for a left-wing government coming in if it's happy with that situation.
Thank you very much. And finally, we now have Chris to speak to this.
Of course, we can build 300,000 homes a year, but we won't get anywhere near 300,000 just continuing as we are. Last year, we built only 110,000 homes. We need a much greater sense of urgency and ambition to get the housing numbers that we need. It's worth considering for a moment just what that 300,000 is. We've got 232,000 growth in household numbers according to the official projections. But more than that, what people often lose sight of is the fact that we've not been building enough houses for a generation. Not in any single year since 1980 have we built enough homes. And the cumulative backlog from that alone is over 1 million homes. So we also need to make inroads into that 1 million as well. So it's absolutely not 200,000. It's not absolutely not some other obscure number which you don't define. It's 300,000, and we should be clear about that. Most people accept there's a housing shortage. Polling commissioned by the recent Wolfson Prize showed that 72% agreed there is a serious shortage of good housing which people can afford. Only 19% of those people disagreed. But the question shouldn't just be about the numbers. It is also about building homes in the right places, where they're needed the most, loosely where affordability is the worst. So, for example, we need at least 75,000 of the 300,000 to be in London. It's also about having well-designed homes, and I would echo what other panellists have said about that. And our Fringe event last year actually debated the importance of that. And there's also a great amount of importance should also be attached to placemaking as well. I think that is very important. The idea that we can just build houses and not build the community facilities, the green spaces, and have consideration to the sense of place, it really is very important that we do that. So how to get there? Well, before I get onto that, let's just debunk some myths. First, the first myth. The only way to get to 300,000 is large-scale council house building. Well, I'm sorry, that's nonsense. The private sector managed it perfectly well prior to the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. Second myth, that somehow if we stop immigration, we would be building enough houses. Again, that's an ill-informed notion. Only a quarter of the 300,000 is attributable to migration. So even if we closed the borders tomorrow, we still wouldn't be building enough. Third myth, that building 300,000 houses means concreting over the countryside or concreting over areas of outstanding natural beauty. No, it doesn't. It's absolute nonsense. Currently, only 9% of land in England is built on, and even that estimate includes back gardens. If we were to build 300,000 for another 20 years, that 9% might grow to 10%, 10.5% at most. So this absolutely isn't about concrete. So what can be done? Well, there's a gap somewhere between 100 and 150,000. I think there needs to be more self-build. Local authorities should be obliged to release land for development, for self-build, for local people. Fewer than 10% of the homes built in this country are self-build versus 45% in the US and more than 50% in Europe. We also should be thinking much more seriously and much more vigorously about new garden settlements. And I don't just mean garden cities, I mean towns and villages as well. Many homeowners object to new development on their doorstep, particularly if it's built in the green field near to where they walk their dogs or pick their blackberries, or if their outlook is affected. They also might feel that too much pressure would be placed on their local schools and roads. And, you know, some are right about this. These are examples of what economists call externalities. New garden cities and settlements move us away fundamentally from the externality argument. And again, the Wolfson polling showed that 74% of people think it is a good idea to build new garden settlements. Finally, on planning, I'm absolutely a pragmatist. I don't think we're going to see the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act suddenly swept away. So I'm just going to offer some overarching thoughts on planning, again echoing some of what some of the panellists have said. The first is land is scarce, and the reason land and house prices are so expensive is because it is scarce. The reason we have so few house builders is because land is scarce. It's a symptom of the problem. The only players who can compete for the land are the big players of the world. So the way that you get more smaller players delivering more houses and different groups of people is by having more land. Second, the reason for that scarcity of land is absolutely planning, and let's not beat about the bush about that. So just a few thoughts. Development has to be by local consent. Absolutely agree with that. Not imposed by Whitehall, but that neighbourhood plans and local referendums should be the driving force of what gets built. And that is why good design and a sense of placemaking and local engagement, not through local authorities, but directly with local people themselves involved. That is why those things are so important, so that people, local people, actually accept development. We've got to fundamentally shift people's attitudes to new development, to new settlements and developments that are visionary and that people can point to in a positive way. Regrettably, the NIMBYs often have a point in opposing new development, given what they've ended up with over the last 30 years. We need to fundamentally change that. We need to fundamentally shift the arithmetic.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to all four of our speakers. We've had some really interesting points on the quality of development, on consent, and on the role of the state and the private sector. And as they were speaking, I did see a satisfying range of nods, frowns, and shaking of heads. So I'm looking forward to lots of great questions from the audience. If I could make a plea before I do open the floor up, please ask questions rather than give mini talks, because it disappoints everyone else in the room when you do that. And if you do keep talking, I'll tell you to shut up. So we'll take questions in groups of 3. We'll have the man over there, and then the chap in the red tie and the guy at the front.
My observation from moving into Sheffield is that a lot of poor people's housing has been taken over by students, at the same time as a very recent development of large numbers of privately owned, very tall buildings built specially for students. It seems to me if there was a bit more of that on some of the old factory sites within the city, some more of this building of units for students, we would then release those houses, the small terrace houses, back for ordinary residents. That would be a great contribution, I think.
Great, thank you. There's a guy in the red tie there.
Thank you very much. My name is Guy Vincent. I'm a councillor in London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. Now, the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham has probably the most valuable real estate in the planet. And the problem, we haven't got any problem with people building houses. We've got queues and queues of developers wanting to build houses and loads of houses being built. The problem we've got is that they're not affordable. And so the challenge I've got for the panel is how can we actually enable people in my borough and similar boroughs to actually be able to live or rent. The problem is partly planning is an issue, because the problem is also I sit down with developers and they tell me that they've done their viability report and sadly there's just no profit in it. And so they're not going to be able to build any affordable housing. What can we do about that?
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, the at the front.
My question is about effective land use, which nobody mentioned. I can give you two examples where this has been a problem. Sorry, I should say I'm an architect, so I design houses. One was a developer who came to me, and on a site where you could fit 24 houses, he instead opted to build 9 bungalows, because then he could avoid his contributions for social housing, green space, education, etc. And another client of mine who built a 6-bed house on land that could easily accommodate three or four very good standard houses. So how would you address effective land use?
Great, thanks for those 3 questions. So we've got student housing and sort of purposes of different housing units, then we've got affordable housing and effective land use. So Jeremy, do you want to go first? Answering those?
Yeah, well, I think if I could start with the last question first. I think the issue of density is very important, and density linked to communities is important. I heard a great statistic once that a community has to have a church, a pub and a shop, and you have to walk to all 3. Well, if you're going to get sufficient density of housing to get people living close enough to each other they can do that, you need to build very good housing. I think issues like noise transfer, fire risk and everything else needs to take into account. But I think there is, you said exactly right, there is no argument as why density can't be improved. The planning issue I raised earlier in terms of what's preventing this actually links into that, because the idea of developers building a fewer number on a large plot to avoid planning rules is nonsense. And the density can be increased very easily. I think to some extent then that goes back to the question in terms of affordability, because there is obviously a supply and demand issue, and if we can actually get that density up and get the number built higher in smaller areas, it will inevitably have an impact on supply and demand. But I think, as the question has said, the housing associations clearly have a role to play in this, and actually just leaving the free open market to allow planners or developers to develop what they want anywhere will not help that affordability issue. And the example of the student housing is a great one of a way of building better, higher quality accommodation and freeing up other accommodation for different uses.
Great. Roberta, if you could answer those questions too, and I could just tack on a very quick question on the affordable point, which is, could Labour ever return to building proper social housing, or would it all be affordable from now on?
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm going to start with the question about student housing, and this is something that I think about every single day, because my constituency is one that's lost a lot of very good family housing in the city centre to student accommodation. And what's happening now is that we're getting purpose-built student accommodation, but we also have students living in the terraced housing in the city centre because the university is growing its numbers. And I think we'll only be able to see a release of family housing if your local council has very strong policies in its local plans to be able to do that, and probably supplementary planning guidance. So it might help at the margins, but I actually think we're some way from those houses being released back into general usage, because I just don't see it happening quickly enough. Right, I'm going to come to this issue about affordability, because we did put it on the Lions agenda, and I think it answers your question as well. Look, for many, many people, 80% of market rent or market price is not affordable, and that's not just London, that's across the country. It is absolute nonsense. And I mean, I think we've really been quite robust about this from the Labour point of view, saying this is not affordable housing. We must not call it affordable housing. It's a complete misnomer, and we have to create a space for housing associations and councils to be able to build houses and deliver them at social rents. And we have to be able to do that without there being a lot of additional money around to be able to subsidise it. And some of it will be using the money that is in the system a bit more effectively, and helping housing associations and local government use the borrowing powers that's already available to them to be able to build more and to get more long-term investment into housing right across the different tenures. And what lots of developers are saying to me and to other members of the team is they need certainty. It's actually not a lack of funding. There's lots of people and lots of investors sort of queuing up wanting to invest in housing. What they feel they don't have is certainty and long-term security in order to release those funds for long-term investment. And related to that is the point I wanted to make about local plan making, is that partly tackles some of the things Shaun said. At the moment, we have a planning system that is plan-led, apparently, but for local authorities that don't have a plan in place, there's presumption in favour of development. So the window is being used by developers to bring forward unsuitable sites. And quite frankly, that doesn't help anybody. And we've got to stop that happening. And one of the things that we're looking at is requiring local authorities to produce plans, putting them on a statutory footing and trying to speed up the process. And it partly answers your question about densities, because then if you have a local plan in place, local communities can decide what density is appropriate, and it will be different in different places. And it has to be, because there are different needs.
Do you want to come back to that? You're putting a face.
Yeah, I work in Wales in a lot of different regions, and density's never been a factor on the plans. So, sorry.
Yeah, density's never been a factor in the plans, the ones that I've worked with. And I'll find that somebody will move to the area and they'll buy 4 or 5 plots to build one big house on it, and so then you've immediately taken housing out of the area.
But you see, if you do what we want to do, which is bring neighbourhood planning into the local plan making system, then we should already have, once we get it in place and we get the reviews in place so this can be added on, the local community might have decided that that land has got to be used for 26 houses, and it will be in the local plan.
Okay, Shaun?
Yeah, I won't attempt to answer all the questions. Just the point about viability. I do think local authorities need more help from the government, more guidance on how to measure viability. You know, if the house builders are saying in their annual reports that they are aiming at a minimum return on capital of 25%, then of course they're not going to be able to build many affordable houses. And so, you know, local authorities do need more help in querying this whole muddy question of viability and deliverability that's in the NPPF. I just, if I may, Isabel, I just want to return to my hobby of having fights with Policy Exchange about planning, because Policy Exchange was created by Nick Bowles and kind of from the very beginning regarded the planning system as a kind of monstrous Soviet imposition which needed to be swept away to let the market triumph. I was complimenting Chris earlier and saying that actually, given the increasingly fantastic pronouncements of the Institute of Economic Affairs on the planning system, Policy Exchange now seems quite sensible and centrist by comparison, but it is only by comparison. And essentially, you have had your man in charge for several years. You've now got your predecessor advising the Prime Minister on planning, Policy Exchange has been, you can put this on your leaflets and things, Policy Exchange has been the most effective advocate in the area of planning for the last 10 years, and has been hugely successful in weakening the planning system. But you're still not getting the houses built. And so people like James O'Shaughnessy, also previously at Policy Exchange, are now saying, oh, let's sweep the whole thing away, just buy off communities and abolish the planning system, and it's all Soviet, etc., etc., etc. The planning is a symptom of the fact that you can't get consent for development. And if you want a democratic system, you're going to have to persuade people that they should agree to development. And I think the whole blaming it on planning is just a huge distraction. And the last thing I'd say is about the sort of whether it's 9% built up, 10%, 10.5%. The important thing is how people feel. Kate Barker, in her review of planning for the last government, had a Moray survey which asked people how much of the countryside the country they thought was built up. And I think in the southeast, people thought more than 50% was built up. And actually the figure is about 10 or 11%. But Kate Barker herself said that when she goes round parts of the southeast, it seems like 50%, because you're always in sight or sound of built development. And people do, I'm afraid, really value the countryside. So whatever result we get, sure, we need to build many more houses, but let's use some of the derelict land in towns and cities. Let's try and use the planning system to regenerate places. Let's, as the Labour Party, should be really proud of what it achieved in the last government in terms of the Brownfield First, which was actually started by John Gummer in 1990. The Brownfield First principle really helped restore lots of towns and cities that were declining and are now much more buzzing and vibrant, and that's a function of the planning system. And you need to build on that and not simply assume that that it's necessary for new housing to sprawl into the countryside.
Great, well, thank you for that. I should say that Chris is actually getting off rather lightly, because a couple of years ago when I chaired a Policy Exchange Fringe, Don Foster threatened to strangle Alex Morgan, who was one of his former colleagues. So actually that was really quite
to leave unscathed.
do please respond.
Nick Bowles spent last year's Tory conference shouting at me as well, by the way.
First of all, I wanted to pick up on a gentleman's point about housing for students, and I think there is a genuine question there about effective use of the housing stock and freeing up housing for other people to use. I think that's twofold. I think a lot of the sort of large-scale stuff for students is institutional investment. And we absolutely need to get more institutional investment into the private rented sector, into student house building, including actually potentially getting housing associations to do some of that stuff as well, because they're well placed in terms of the clientele that they're responding to. I think another area where effective use of the stock is also with older people. And I was actually having a conversation with my parents about this over the weekend, and this issue about downsizing and moving to something else, so that instead of living in a 4-bedroom detached house that a family could use, you'd move into a 2-bed bungalow or something like that. And what they were saying to me is that they would be quite happy to downsize and to move to an alternative house if there was some decent choice out there. So I think there's something to be said about ensuring that there's a better offer for more people, and particularly dealing with the issue of housing for older people, given that is one of the key drivers behind the 232,000 household growth number. So I think that's the first thing. On the point about the Hammersmith and Fulham and the issue of affordability there, look, the economics of this will tell you that the only way to get affordable housing, whether it's in the space of rents or whether it's in ownership or in social housing, the issue of tenure is an absolute red herring. It doesn't matter whether you build, whether if you've got to build 10,000 houses, it doesn't matter whether it's for rent, for home ownership or whatever. You've still got to build 10,000 houses to stabilise the affordability in that area. And there's no way of getting around that, because it's a fundamental interaction of supply and demand. So really important to recognise that. Effective land use. I think density and densification does have a role, but not everywhere. I think certainly in London and places like that, I think having a greater density is certainly something I think we have to look at. Obviously there are practical issues of that, because not least the fact that you have to demolish what's already there invariably to be able to improve density in existing developments, as well as looking at increasing the density of the new stuff. I don't think it should be a requirement, but I think it has to be part of the sensible debate. And one example of where you can do better density actually is through the regeneration of social housing estates, and we're starting to see some of that in London. We need to see it happen more speedily. So people often perceive that these huge tower blocks with vast swathes of land around them are dense. Actually, they're not. Actually, if you were to demolish them and build low-rise housing, which is more sensibly spaced, the density would be higher. So certainly something there on density. And I know a number of the volume house builders would actually agree with that sentiment.
I'm going to cut you off now because I want to give some more people a chance to ask questions, if that's okay.
Okay, well, can I just sort of quickly respond on the point that, yeah, you do need more greenfield, land. This notion that there is enough brownfield land in the system to build more housing is nonsense. It doesn't have to be areas of outstanding natural beauty. In fact, some of it can even be greenbelt, which is actually the biggest misnomer out there. The majority of greenbelt is not green, it is brown or it is grey.
I thought you were such a sensible chap, Chris, honestly. So nice before the meeting.
Over half of it is intensive agricultural farmland. So for people thinking that the greenbelt is there for environmental credentials, where intensive farmland has the worst environmental credentials
we have to
going,
eat, don't we? You do have to eat.
You're just completely misinformed.
Jolly good. Right. Next questions, please. I've got a guy at the back there, give us a purplish shirt, I think. Sort of.
Andrew Dixon from the Federation of Master Builders. We represent a large number of small and medium-sized house builders. Really pleased to hear Roberta and others talk about the contribution that smaller house builders will need to make, and also custom build, the contributions that both of those sectors are going to need to make if we're going to get anywhere near 300,000. Smaller house builders build out smaller sites, but the planning system tends to have an excessive focus on larger strategic sites. So I wanted to ask the panel, how do we improve the focus of the planning system in terms of the way it deals with those smaller sites, and in terms of custom build as well? If we're going to scale up the custom build model, we're going to need the provision of a lot of service plots which require funding of infrastructure. So how do the panel see that being funded and by who?
Okay, another question? Guy there in the sort of checked shirt.
Shaun Fitzsimons, Councillor in London Borough of Croydon. I have to say, I think Shaun has been very kind to Chris. Because actually, some of the statements and some of the myths that no one seems to be challenging, I'm sure people come back. Don't bear, any strength at all. In particular, that that the private sector effectively can build 300,000 homes and just needs shackles taken off it. The reality is that garden cities, in limited cases, may have a place. But if you look over England at the moment in Scotland, people have tried to build these suburban, out-of-town centres before, and because the infrastructure wasn't put in there, it was taking years. I mean, an area near me in Croydon, New Addington, it took 50 years to get a tram link up there. And even now, with 30,000, 40,000 people, it can't sustain supermarkets, it has difficulties sustaining schools. We may be wasting a whole load of infrastructure money trying to extend cities when we need to intensify them. So the question that I want to get to is, the state does have a role, but ultimately it isn't about planning, isn't it more about subsidy?
Great, thank you. We'll just take one more and then we'll go back to planning. Who else has a question? Lady there? Yeah.
Susan Emmett, Savills Research. I just want to refer to the elephant in the room, which is the cyclical nature of the UK housing market. One of the reasons we are in the situation we are in at the moment with low house building is the economic downturn we've just had. Any ideas from the panel on how we solve that one?
Marvellous. Okay, brilliant. Jeremy?
I shouldn't have said this then, should I? Okay, I guess the first, the smaller sites, smaller house builders, and that does link into the custom build. I think clearly planning does have a role to play in this. The fact that one large site would have planning for one house builder to build a large number of houses is a quirk of the planning system. There's no reason why it couldn't be dedicated into 10 smaller house builders, each having their own plots. So I think clever use of the planning system can affect that. But the sort of question then linked into the infrastructure needed, and I can't help thinking that in the greenfield, brownfield debates at the right-hand end of the table, as I sort of drove in here today, I came through the sort of suburb of Manchester I came in from the Sheffield side of the town, and there are large areas of brownfield land ripe for development within 2 miles of where we're sitting right now, with great transport links, etc. So I think a innovative developer could find some ways of building very attractive, affordable housing close to where we're sitting now with existing transport and infrastructure links in place. So I think it is a matter of developers working harder on this supply-demand balance, and the planners giving them the freedom to do that. And then the debate got onto the sort of garden cities and the idea that, I guess a garden city, therefore, by default, has to be in some way greenfield. Well, if you think of Ebbsfleet, which is just about to start development, the vast majority, I think probably nearly 100% of Ebbsfleet, is in fact brownfield land. So we can build a garden city on brownfield land, and it does already have existing infrastructure with the Channel Tunnel rail link going through there. In terms of the question on planning and subsidy, I guess to some extent it's the same question as it's a carrot and a stick at the end of the day. I think we can use the planning system as a carrot and we can use it as a stick. When it's used as a carrot, it feels like a subsidy, but actually we need to encourage the right building in the right locations, and we need to get developers to think in that way, and using the planning system in that process seems a very clever way of doing it. I'll default to answering the last question until we've been down the table to give me a chance to think about it, because I have no answer to the economic problems of the UK, but I'll think of something.
That means you're hoping for another row at this end.
We're out of time.
Roberta.
Okay. Well, you'll know that we've asked the Lions Commission to look specifically at how to open up land markets to smaller size builders, and some of the way of doing that will be partnerships with the public sector of their ownership, of the land as an ownership to them. I mean, I also think that interestingly, some of what the government's doing on local development orders and bringing small brownfield sites forward for LDOs might help as well. So, we're looking at that, see how it works out in practice. And we have already said that we will change the MPPF to strengthen brownfield first and put it back to what was really a very successful policy under Labour. About 70% of development was taking place in brownfield land compared to about 53% at the moment. However, because of the huge uplift that we need in housing supply, brownfield is just not going to be enough. And I think we have to be really honest about that. And it's not just garden cities. It can be garden villages, it can be urban extensions. Ebbsfleet is a really good example. But I think to try and suggest that we don't need some of those larger developments would be wrong in order to get the uplift that we need. And local authorities, we want to put local authorities in the driving seat for this. And Hilary and myself and others in the team are having discussions with local authorities singly or with partners because they have ideas, and I think we should listen to them and we should support them in those developments, and we'll be giving more information about how we're going to do that in the coming weeks. cyclical nature of the UK housing market, I think the first thing you have to do is recognise that the market doesn't work, and I think that's what we have done. That is firmly on our agenda, that the reason we're not getting the houses that we need is because the UK housing market is broken, and the only way that we're going to fix it is getting more land in the system and more players in the system, and giving local authorities a much, much bigger role in driving developments forward, and some of the tools that they need in order to be able to step in whenever the market is failing, and that's also on our agenda.
Ability to borrow more?
Ah, no. Well, I'm not. I shouldn't say no, because look, we cannot sit here and say that there's going to be a lot more money in the system. We're going to add public sector borrowing. Of course, that is just not possible. But the money that is in the system can be used a bit more effectively than it is at the moment. And there is some headroom already with local authority borrowing. We can persuade local authorities to take that on board and use the borrowing that is available to them, because they're not all doing that at the minute.
So is that you ruling out lifting?
It's not me ruling anything out. It's me saying I'm not allowed to comment. And I'm certainly not. I'm not allowed to do anything that sounds like a spending commitment. So as long as we're absolutely clear about that.
We're now reaching the naughty end of the table. Let Shaun and Chris fight it out.
So thank you. Well, so in reverse order, on the economy, and the house building will pick up as the economy picks up. But the important thing is to avoid the mistake the last government made, which is to confuse a strong economy with a housing bubble. And that's the mistake they made in Spain and Ireland and the United States. So strong economy, housing, and property boom are different things. Shaun, I'm sorry, I certainly wasn't intending to be polite to Policy Exchange, so apologies for that. The example of New Addington and Croydon is a really good one. I mean, I've visited there, and also some estates in Dagenham, kind of low density, good quality housing, lots of gardens. They don't work as communities. Richard Rogers is right that you could get 2 garden cities in Croydon if you had the will to do it, and it would be a much better place to live, much more sustainable, denser. You wouldn't lose good green space and so on. But that would take a real act of will by government. On Andrew's points, well, we've produced a whole report, as you know, which I very much regret we didn't get the Federation of Master Builders to sponsor, because it comes up with all their prescriptions about how to increase diversity in the housing sector. And we've also got a big campaign at the moment called Waste of Space, where we're asking people to tweet in pictures of derelict sites or vacant buildings above shops or whatever, to try to get to try to illustrate just how much brownfield land is out there, and there's a lot. The last one, I mean, you want to scrap Isabel, I can tell that. So just on Chris's point, I mean, on house price inflation, it really is. House price inflation is not just a question of supply and demand, except to an economist, because it's clearly the case that we've had for years a system where successive governments have wanted rising house prices above the rate of inflation. Voters feel good about it, they get second mortgages, it boosts the economy, and so on. But the tax system, the availability of credit, the fact that pensions are not such a good investment as property, all these things mean that house prices are rising more than they should, more than is good for the economy, more than is good for citizens. And it would be really excellent if politicians of all parties committed to saying, actually, what we want is stable house prices. We want more of a German-style system where buying a property isn't always, or almost, for 9 years out of 10, the best way to make a cheap buck, or quick buck. That's a big problem with how we treat housing in this country. That housing is an investment rather than to meet need. And it'll take much braver politicians in the Treasury, not just the CLG, to tackle that one.
Okay, just on the serviceable plots for self-build. At the budget, the government actually did announce some money to provide the infrastructure for those plots. For I think there was something like 150 million made available. It needs to be a lot more than that, obviously, but I think that was a step in the right direction. Absolutely, there has to be the infrastructure in place, and we need to make that happen. On the there was a comment, I think, from the gentleman over there about the 300,000. I'm not saying that garden cities are the whole answer. I'm simply saying that the scale of the challenge is so huge that it's probably going to take a number of solutions, not just a single one. That said, I do think new garden settlements, whether it's cities or towns or villages, can make a sizable contribution. On the cyclical nature of the cyclical nature of housing and the housing market, I'm afraid, again, it all boils down to the fact that there is not enough land, and the more scarce the land is in the system, the more volatility that you're going to have. And I think there are a few interesting things just to point out. The first is that even at the height of the recent housing boom, we still did not build enough houses. I think we got to something like 170. That says that the issue is not cyclical, it is structural, because even then we didn't get the numbers that we needed. The fundamental problem, of course, is that you've actually got, if you like, a free market demand side of the housing market and the Soviet-style command and control side for the supply side, which is through the planning system. And of course, you put the two together, and the only thing that can respond to volatile demand is volatile house prices. And of course, that is exactly what you get. And just responding to the point about house prices being speculative, well, in the long run, they're not. And if you look at the trend rate of house price growth, even Kate Barker said that it was 2.7% in real terms. Now, you only have to start compounding that for a few years, and it is massive. So we're talking about trend here. We're not talking about cycles. We're not talking about speculation. We're talking, if you get rid of all that noise, what is fundamentally happening. And I'm sorry, but you know, any economist worth his salt will tell you that that fundamental trend, long-term position, is absolutely the interaction of demand and supply. To say otherwise would be defying gravity.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Well, we're reaching the end of our session now. So to close, I thought I'd ask each of the panellists to tell us what one thing they'd really like to change about the planning system. These two can't name each other, but just a super speedy concluding remark. And we'll start at this end of the table, just so Jeremy doesn't feel like I'm picking on him. Chris, if you want to start.
I think one of the big failures is probably at the planning committee stage, where what you tend to see happening is a lot of the NIMBY type having a much greater voice than the silent majority sometimes, who would actually perhaps be more welcoming to new development. So I think some way, perhaps this way, through more democratisation of the planning system is definitely the way forward. I think neighbourhood plans are a step in the right direction.
Well, I was going to say brownfield first, but I know Roberta's going to say that, so I don't want to steal her thunder. A proper strategic planning system that balances out growth across the country, I think, would be the main change.
I'm not going to say brownfield first. I'm going to say to stop blaming the planning system for the lack of delivery of housing, because it isn't the planning system. I mean, lots of local authorities are struggling to get enough land into their 5-year land supply, and that's not because there isn't a will there, it's because they don't have people bringing the land forward, and that is the real issue that has to be tackled. So I think planning is part of the solution to the number of houses that have to be built, not part of the problem, and I just despair. I want planning to go back to its visionary roots, to really deliver for the communities for the future, and we have to stop blaming it for something that's not within its remit.
I think, following on from that really, I think I'd like to see planning linked to what's built. I think in terms of the quality of what's built, the environmental impact of what's built, density, a question referred to earlier. I think making sure that it's easier to get planning for something which is durable, has a low environmental impact, should be an advantage of the planning system, and density linked into that as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers, and it's so encouraging to see so many people in the audience so engaged with this issue as well. In my first job as a housing journalist, we called around all the three parties at the 2010 election, pleading with them to put housing in their manifestos, but I don't think this time round we're going to need to do that because it's become such a big issue, which is hugely encouraging. Can we give a round of applause to our speakers?